Hi, this is Gotham Balaji again with East Brunswick Academy, and this is APUSH Chapter 2, The Planting of the English in America. So, religious conflict. Well, there was religious conflict in England, starting with the Protestant Reformation in the 1500s, with fights and battles with Henry VIII's dissension from the Roman Catholic Church, and he in turn founded the Church of England, a Protestant denomination within Europe. Now, this caused to have a rift and a balance of power between the Protestants and the Catholics to rage on for centuries, until Elizabeth I's reign, where the idea of being Protestant took hold in England and became the main denomination of England for years to come. Now, Ireland, which was usually been Catholic, they tried to overthrow Elizabeth with Spanish help and Spanish influence with resources, but they were brutally put down, which also set up for the future rivalry between England and Spain. And now also the person who helped put down the Irish and helped quell the rebellion was Lord De La Ware, who was also one of the people who helped found Maryland, another colony, as we'll learn to see. Now, future rivalries. Now, the Elizabeth encouraged sea dogs, led by Francis Drake, to loot and attack Spanish ships for riches and wealth. These sea dogs were basically pirates and privateers to help attack Spanish ships, take their goods, take their resources, and they did this because they thought that the Spanish were illegally committing trade without, the grand and without the royal crown's consent. So they attacked them to help reimburse themselves, which is what the English philosophy was. Now, Newfoundland was the first English attempt for colonization. It was promoted by Walter Raleigh, who was also the first person to help organize the expedition at Roanoke. Now, both of these colonization attempts failed, and Roanoke was known as a lost colony because after several attempts to help find the colony and bring more resources to the colony just simply disappeared. People think it was because of Native American attacks, or they just starved, but we still don't know what happened to the people at Roanoke. Now, the showdown between the English and the Spanish. So, England and Spain became so embroiled in religious battles and conflicts of colonial interests that there was some battle was supposed to occur. Now, Spain, which was led by Philip II, sent around 130 strong ships, which was called the Spanish Armada, to invade England and gain control of the island in about 1588. Now, this was the largest showdown in European history up until this point. You had the two largest European powers fighting not only for military supremacy, but also for religious supremacy. You have the Catholic Spanish and the Protestant English fighting for what Europe will, then in turn become. Now, this whole effect of the Spanish Armada failed miserably. It marked the end of the Spanish Empire and the end of Spain's dominance in the New World, as more countries like Holland started to gain control of Spain's New World colonies, as you see Holland and France starting to pick apart Spain's possessions all over the Americas. Now, New England specifically. Now, England, with this new, strong, unified national state, and also with its popular Protestant monarch, Elizabeth I, now wanted to have a taste in the colonization game, since Spain was now, not the strongest European power anymore. This also sparked a golden age of literature, which dawned in England with new prosperity, with Shakespeare composing great pieces of prose poetry. I don't find this part of history that interesting, but it's important that you guys understand this for the test that will come. Now, England and Spain signed peace in 1604, which ended their fight of the control of New World and religion and influence over their respective colonies. But this peace treaty in quotes, was basically Spain's way of getting out of Spain's way of getting out of England's new dominance, as England was now the new dominance of colonial expeditions and colonial explorations of the New World. So England's changed. So England had grown from about 3 million people in 1550 to about 4 million people 50 years later in 1600, and they had a mobile population that overcrowded cities and towns. And England had this law of primogeniture, which was the right of succession belonging to the firstborn child. It was especially during feudal rule, by which the whole or real estate of an interstate was passed to the eldest son. Now, because of these laws of primogeniture, there was a very weird property succession in England, as all the property would end up going to the oldest son, and the other sons and the other children would have nothing to start off if their parents died. So it created a lot of peasants and a lot of workers who were unemployed in the English system because they had no property or no wealth to start out with, since the eldest sons and the eldest children got everything. And also, England used joint stock companies to help colonize and establish enterprises in the colonies. And a joint stock company was a company whose stock that was jointly owned by the shareholders, along with the royal crown. And joint stock companies were a way of businesses to help profit off the New World and help profit for themselves, rather than having all the influence being controlled by the royal crown. Now, the government and the parliament did have some control over the joint stock companies, but mostly it was run by these businesses and these investors. So why was there such a thirst for exploration? Now, first, there was a peace with Spain, as now Spain was no longer trying to threaten it for religious and military supremacy within Europe itself. There was a population growth, as you can see. The population of England had increased by about 30% in about 50 years. There's a lot of these employed workers due to these laws of succession with property and their children, and also because of this growing population and these burgeoning workers without having enough markets and industries to support them. There was also philosophical changes in this time in England. People wanted to have adventure. People wanted to have religious freedom as well, and they felt that England was being too restrictive at that time to offer those two rights. So the Virginia Company, now they gave a charter from King James I to help settle in the New World. They promised gold, and they also had a strong desire of finding a passage from America to the Indies. Now, the Virginia Company didn't have, a long-term colonization idea in store. Didn't expect this whole idea of colonizing a certain settlement in the Americas to be a future settlement for years to come. They just thought it was a get-rich-quick scheme. But did it turn out to be that? Well, we're going to find out. Well, more on the Virginia Company. Well, the charter of the Virginia Company gave overseas settlers the same rights of the English that they would have enjoyed if they stayed at home, which was a very monumental decision and a very monumental idea, because it showed that even if you weren't being the same land ruled by that government, you still have the same rights regardless of where you were. And the Virginia settlement landed in a place called Jamestown, and they named the river in 1607 that they saw near the settlement the James River, in honor of the King James I. And this was the first major English settlement in the colonies. Now, Jamestown. The first months were horrible. 40 people perished in the initial voyage, and people died in the shipwreck of Bermuda, and more people died of starvation and disease. So overall, it was just a terrible settlement. They were saved from destruction by John Smith, who did allow for the organization of leadership, as he was a person who came from England in hopes of planting tobacco and help supporting the colony through the growth of this cash crop, and he helped organize them and helped motivate them to help survive and not succumb to the horrible effects of nature. However, John Smith was put under a mock execution by Powhatan, a nearby Indian tribe, but he eventually got himself out of it, and he used his charismatic abilities and leadership skills to get close to Pocahontas, who he eventually married, and have a better relationship with the Indians and the settlers of the area. So even though the relationship was rocky at first between John Smith and the Powhatans, which is the tribe we just named after the chief Powhatan, he helped forge this relationship, even though it was a temporary one, even though it was a fragile one, for some amount of time at least, so that the Jamestown settlers could prosper by themselves. There were hardships and resolves. Many people starved to death during starving time, where they had to eat dogs, cats, rats, and mice. So because there were crop failures and the city really couldn't support its citizens all the time, they had to report to such horrible measures. There was a relief party that came with the new governor, Lord Delaware, which we talked about before, who was also the same person who helped quell the Irish rebellions when the English were still fighting with the Spanish. And Delaware imposed harsh military regime on the entire colony in aggressive action against the Indians. and they did help quell the whole hostility between the two groups. But still, regardless of Delaware's military tactics, life was still hard, and there's little success in Jamestown. So the whole Chesapeake area, well, as we mentioned before, Lord Delaware did use Irish tactics to help fight the Indians. The first Anglo-Powhatan War was in 1614, and this was when John Rolfe married Pocahontas and sealed the deal. I made a mistake before. John Rolfe was not John Smith. John Smith was the first person who came to the colonies, but John Rolfe was who married Pocahontas. My mistake. And John Rolfe's marriage to Pocahontas is what sealed the first Anglo-Powhatan War. The Indian attacks in the Chesapeake left more than hundreds of settlers dead after the Virginia Code created this perpetual war without peace or truce. So the settlers, even with the Delaware regime and even with John Smith's organization, they still weren't at peace with the Indians, and they were never going to be at peace with the Indians, which did inhibit their ability to succeed on their own and succeed in agriculture. And this led to more fighting, and the Second Anglo-Powhatan War was the last effort of the Indians to help dislodge gains by the settlers, but the settlers were won again as they just had more manpower and more supplies, and this marked a future of the actions and the relationship between settlers and Indians. As the settlers would anger the Indians would try to retaliate them and try to have some sort of truce, and then the settlers would just annihilate them with all these resources and with all of their firepower. And as you mentioned before, the peace treaty made it impossible for any assimilation from Indians into Virginia society, and the Powhatans also fell to this other precedent that we're going to establish of these Indians falling to the settlers of disease, disorganization, disposability, as they didn't have the immunities to the diseases that the white people had from Europe. For all centuries before, they weren't as organized. There's all these separate Indian tribes, and even though there's a general leader, that leader could not control all these separate tribes. While the settlers had Lord Delaware and John Smith as their clear leaders, and disposability, like the Spanish used the encomienda system to help integrate the English to help integrate the Indians to their society and have them work. The English didn't see any need for the Powhatans, so that relationship just was not going to last. So this new world of Indians. So they used the horses in the Great Plains, which had assimilated imperfectly and helped the Indians out. Yet, because disease was such a huge disruptor, the old world diseases killed Indians off by generations. So regardless of how much of these old world resources like horses and even plants and even new crops would help them economically and help them live their lives in a certain way, they would still be at a huge health disadvantage due to their lack of immunity to these diseases. Some Indians did trade, however, as there was networks of firearms, skins, pelts, and Indians did have more of a European lure for new goods, as Indians later formed great relationships for trade with both the French and the Dutch. So, which of these Indians had the most devastating effects? So, in the eastern seaboard, these Indians were impacted the most because that was where the settlers would directly settle, but in areas more into the United States and more in the interior, the Algonquins in the Great Lakes, they were a regional power, and they had great strength with the Europeans because they were far away from all the bloodshed and from all the settling, and because they were so far away and they were near a lot of rivers and resources, they dealt in trade from an advantage of strength. So tobacco. So John Rolfe helped create tobacco in the tobacco industry in the colonies, and he perfected the methods of raising and curing the crop, creating massive demand for the crop in Europe. Now, this in turn, prosperity, which finally came after decades of hardship in Jamestown, allowed Virginia to be built on tobacco and nicotine, which however ruined the soil for years to come and promoted the plantation system and demand for more labor, as they couldn't solely rely on the crops and solely rely on the soil, so they needed to exploit as much land as possible, as areas of land would just erode and be uninhabitable to use and to plant crops. Now, the Dutch were the first. They were the first contingency to purchase 20 Africans, as they did in 1619, and it was the spark of the slave plantation system in the Americas, as these Europeans saw that these Africans could be used for labor and could be used to help produce these cash crops. Now, overall, Virginia had a self-government with the House of Burgesses, which was a precedent for the Assembly of Commoners to decide the fate of the state. As the House of Burgesses was made up of aristocrats, but they were also made up of commoners as well, and they had the first presidential, not presidential, but presidential form of government, as it was a form of Congress in a way, in sorts. And as time passed, James I, the cranky King of England, he grew hostile to Virginia. He hated the tobacco and he distrusted the government, and therefore he later revoked the charter and made Virginia a royal colony and directly under the crown. So as you can see, Virginia was first prospering under the idea of a joint stock company, but then James I got irritated with all their influence and with all of their, economic prowess, and he made them a royal colony just to show them who's boss. Maryland was another Chesapeake colony. They were the first plantation colony to be a religious refuge for Catholics, founded by Lord Baltimore to help reap financial profits. Baltimore gave huge estates to the Catholics and large houses, and these colonies proved to come as more and more land was offered to the settlers, as colonists were incentivized by all of these new huge acres of land. And Maryland prospered because it depended on labor in the early years, and the indentured servants came to work in large numbers. This is a huge difference to other areas at this time period, because Maryland had a sufficient labor force and they weren't just individual farms like Virginia. Maryland also had the Act of Toleration, which was the idea to give tolerance to all practitioners of Christianity. It did have a death penalty for all Jews and atheists, but it was the first act of religious tolerance in the New World and set future precedents, as you can see, with the freedom of religion and the Constitution. And here we go back to Spain. So Spain was weakened by this military over these large areas of expansion, so they just relaxed the grip on their colonies. They had the sugar plantations in the West Indies, but after the peace treaty between England and Spain, England soon took over the West Indian economy, and they used tobacco as a setting stone, but they mainly use those West Indies places and the sugar islands to make sugar, because they thought sugar was a rich man's crop. And England imported about 250,000 Africans to help run the plantations, and by 1700, blacks outnumbered white settlers more than 4-1. It's a staggering number. So to help control these new slaves, England created slave codes like the Barbados Slave Code, which gave the owners and masters complete control to domineer and have ultimate influence over the lives of slaves, disciplining them for slight infractions. So we have to compare something. So just like the West Indies had been the training ground for the encomienda system that the Spanish had brought to Mexico and South America, the Caribbean islands for the English served as a staging area for the slave system that would take place in English and North America. So, the English Civil War. So, Charles I dismissed Parliament in 1629 and recalled them in 1640, but Puritan soldier Oliver Cromwell beheaded Charles in 1649 and then ruled England for a decade under a very strong Protestant grip. And Charles II was put back into power afterwards and was given the Carolinas as a colony named after him. And Charles II then gave it to the Lords Proprietors, a group of ministers who were basically his devoted followers. So, the Carolinas. The Carolinas had close economic ties with the Sugar Islands, as many settlers from the Barbados were also slave owners who came to the Carolinas to help profit off the slave trade. And also, there were a lot of Indians in the area, like the Savannah Indians, and because these Indians thought that slave trade was out of control, they cut off any diplomatic ties with the colonists because they thought that they were brutal and they were just unfair to be equals with the Indians. And this disrespect and this lack of camaraderie with the Carolinians caused them just to be upset and just decimate all the decimate all the Indian tribes in the area and make the rest of them their slaves. Rice was obviously the most important crop in the Carolina, and it increased the cultivation of rice when more slaves were shipped. And Carolina was also the center of the slave trade within the Americas, and also the external trade with the West Indies as well. So it was a very important part in the colony's economy at this point. North Carolina was totally different. It was made of squatters and poverty-stricken farmers who left South Carolina. Now, these were poorer than the South Carolina area because these were individual farming rather than the large-scale plantations. The members of the state crushed the Tuscarora Indians in a namesake war, and they sold hundreds to slavery. So even though they were poorer and had less resources, they were still just as brutal as the South Carolinians. And they also defeated the Yamasee Indians with the South Carolinians together. So there was a rocky relationship between the two Carolinas, but overall they still share the same idea of slavery and killing the Indians in the area. How brutal and unfortunate it is, but it's the truth. Georgia was different. It was created as a buffer colony to help protect the valuable Carolinas and to help separate them from the Spanish-controlled Florida. It was established as a debtor colony in England in honor of King George II of England, obviously. It's founded by James Oglethorpe, a very good guy and a warrior in England as well. It was a melting pot community. It was full of German Lutherans, Scots Highlanders, as well as denominations of all Christian faiths except Catholic, which was solely from in Maryland. And this grew very slowly because they refused to import large amounts of slaves because they wanted to have economic opportunities for white settlers instead, and that in turn really spurred the ability of the Georgian economy to really grow. So, conclusion. So, overall, all the plantation colonies were devoted to exporting these commercial agricultural products and cash crops. Slavery was founded in all these plantation colonies, even though at different extremes and probably the lowest in Georgia, and they were basically used to run and make these colonies successful economically. And I think something that's really surprising is that they all permitted some level of religious toleration, and the Church of England became the dominant faith in a lot of these areas. So all these areas become Protestant except Maryland, which was founded as a refuge for Catholics. So overall, this is the end of the chapter. I covered everything you need to know for the test, and after hearing this lecture, you should be more than prepared to get a good grade. So thank you for listening, and be tuned for chapter 3.